Here we are, week 5, audio number 3, and we're starting on slide 18. As things got worse in the countryside, Mao Zedong had done his own investigation using one of his secretaries, one of his confidential assistants, and had determined that, things aren't quite going well in the countryside. We're not really getting truthful reports of the actual production levels, and things are backfiring. So he initiated this conference to talk about it, and it was a terrible thing that happened. I should mention, by the way, that Lushan is in central China, and it's a mountain resort. Chiang Kai-shek used to go there too and have conferences. In the summertime, it's nice and cool. I don't know if this photograph was taken during that conference, but anyway, the picture was taken in early 1959, and this is how the two gentlemen looked, Peng Dehuai and Mao Zedong. Peng Dehuai had been a senior military leader even as early as the Long March. He had participated in the Long March. That's a big thing. Of course, all the Long March veterans are now in their 90s, but in this early period of the PRC, it was a big thing if you were a Long March veteran, because as we discussed earlier, not that many people survived. And it was a big event in party history. Peng Dehuai had also commanded Korean forces, Chinese forces in Korea during the war against the Americans. He had great status in the party and was defense minister at this time. He wrote a letter to Mao Zedong and said in this letter that he was very humble, and he said that things are not going very well. We really ought to look more into this. And this made Mao furious. And I think that this may not quite be explained very well in the readings. Why did this make Mao furious? He had already concluded that there were problems in the countryside and that the situation, the policies needed to be changed. And I think that, again, this is a subjective Mao thought sort of thing. Who knows what the bastard was thinking. But I believe that his mindset, based on his writings, was that he was like the emperor, and no one can come out and criticize him, even if that criticism is correct. I can criticize myself, but anybody who dares to make me look bad is an enemy. And indeed, Mao doubled down afterward. He sort of forgot about what he already knew and called for higher targets and determined that pushing people harder would solve the problems. Unfortunately, this didn't happen. An enormous number of people died. There are books that have been written about this. The awful details included people eating the bark off of trees. That is, anybody who traveled in the countryside during this period would find that the trees didn't have any bark on them because people were stripping it off and boiling it and eating it because they had nothing else to eat. People were cannibalizing dead bodies. That is, they were taking dead bodies of people who starved to death and eating them. Cannibalism was a common thing during this period, and the studies that have been done through witness interviews and so on by both Chinese and Western authors have established this as an absolute fact. Cannibalism was a big deal back then. And interestingly, if you remember Edgar Snow, the American author of Red Star Over China, who traveled to Yan'an in Bao'an in 1935 and interviewed Mao, the first Western reporter to interview Mao. He was a friend of the Chinese Revolution, and he went to China during this period himself. He was taken all over in a guided tour, kept in a cocoon of sorts in 1961, and he was there for about a month. And the next year he published a book called The Other Side of the River. And in The Other Side of the River, Edgar Snow described how there was no famine in China, everything was fine, people are living a happy life, blah, blah, blah. So it's something to keep in mind when you think about the ability of the very disciplined Chinese Communist Party to pull the wool over the eyes of foreign visitors. They do it. They did it back then. They do it today. It is what it is, and you have to be careful about information coming out of the propaganda department of the Chinese Communist Party. Moving along to slide 19. The famine is getting worse and worse, but what is Mao interested in? Mao is interested in initiating a criticism campaign against Peng Dehuai as a national priority. At the same time, the rest of the leadership can read the tea leaves. They know that criticizing Mao is like a death sentence. As a matter of fact, if you don't praise Mao enough, that might be a death sentence too. So the praise that poured forth for the chairman was obsequious and ridiculous, but it was what it was. If you take a look here at this Renmin Herbal, this People's Daily issue from August of 1959, you can see that, that establishing the enemy status of Peng Dehuai was page 1 above the fold, the most important story probably of the week. Let's go on to slide 20. So Mao actually, at this point, according to the book by Li Zhisui, who was Mao's physician at this time, in 1961, he began to recognize, in 62, he began to really recognize what was going on. He was a fat bastard at this time, and perhaps to make himself more attractive during this famine period, he decided to forego meat. I'm not kidding. This was his sacrifice. He decided to stop eating meat during the famine. And he decided to retreat from agricultural and economic policymaking during this time. However, I call this, in the first slide there, a phony retreat, because even though he criticized himself and apologized for the policies that led to the famine, during the 7,000 Cadres conference in early 1962, his subordinates would have none of it. They made more speeches of fulsome praise for the chairman because they knew what was good for them, quite frankly. They did cut investment in things that had nothing to do with solving the famine. But Mao Zedong, while he retreated from elements of policy that affected the famine so that others could clean up the mess, he never stopped being concerned with ideology and the loyalty of his subordinates. And he watched as Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai Luo Rei-ching and others, Luo Rei-ching being the Minister of Public Security, but by this time now he was the Minister of Defense, excuse me. Luo Rei-ching had been transferred in 1959 from being Minister of Public Security to Minister of National Defense to replace Peng Dehuai. And Mao noticed that ideological work in the army had been lessened, and he was not happy with that because he believed that keeping the army under close ideological control was very important. He was not happy really with what was being done to correct the problems of the famine. And he knew that his position in society was so secure, was so dominant, that even in the midst of this horrible tragedy, that he could call upon the Central Committee to never forget class struggle. And he began in the countryside. If this sounds familiar, it should, because winning the countryside first and surrounding the cities was his strategy during the Chinese Communist Revolution. He started in the countryside, and he began to root out of the party those cadres who had a little bit too enthusiastically embraced these reforms against extreme collectivization, going down to the household responsibility system, for example, which meant, we just talked about how the level of accounting during the 1950s had been raised, first from the village level to groups of villages, and then quotas were given to entire counties. On the communes now that had been established, the level of accountability was taken down to the household. And cadres who too enthusiastically pursued that were now under attack through the urging of Mao's lieutenants in the provinces. These people, like the unfortunate gentleman in the middle of this photograph, were attacked for trying to bring production back. And there were always, you'd sort of wonder, why in the hell would people do this? You know, didn't they want to have food again? But it's not easy to explain this, and I certainly wasn't there. From my own experience with Chinese society, I would have to say that most people hang back from problems like this, and there's always a few enthusiastic and ambitious people who will do what higher authority thinks needs to be done as long as they think they have backing. And I think the man who's addressing the unfortunate cadre in this picture is probably one of those people. Let's go on. We won't talk about the 4 cleanups in detail. You can get that in the readings. Let's go on to slide 21 and talk about what was going on at the same time. The Sino-Soviet split began really in 1956-57. One could say it began with Khrushchev's secret speech in 55, I suppose, which is when Mao Zedong first began to be upset with Khrushchev, eventually considering him to be inadequate and not equal to Mao in his stature as a revolutionary communist leader, because after all, during World War II, Mao was the up-and-coming leader of a socialist China, who was taking orders directly from Stalin. Who was Khrushchev during World War II? Why, he was a colonel in the Soviet army. He was nothing. He was one of Stalin's lieutenants during the early 50s. And Mao's view of Khrushchev gradually grew darker and darker as year passed upon year in the late 1950s. And one of the things that produced a split between the two gentlemen, who obviously in this picture seem to have had the same tailor, but never mind, was that during 1958, Mao Zedong made a speech that was not public, but it was circulated among the CPSU, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and among the CCP, saying that if there was a Third World War, a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, that it wouldn't be all bad, because after all, the socialist world has more people, far more people as a matter of fact. The socialist world would come out on top because they would have the most survivors. Khrushchev and the rest of the Russian Politburo were appalled when they heard this, and they began to wonder about this guy, whom the year before they had promised an atomic bomb. And so, just before the Lushan plenum, which we discussed a few minutes ago, when Mao purged Peng Dehuai, Khrushchev declared in a secret message to Mao that he was annulling the agreement to supply a bomb to China. And as things got worse and worse, eventually the acrimonious exchanges between the two sides resulted in Khrushchev's decision to withdraw the 1,400 Russian advisors from China in July of 1960. And part of the reason for this was not just his being pissed off at Mao, it was also a safety consideration. He began to wonder if these advisors would be protected by the PRC government, or if they would end up being held as hostages. And so he decided to get them out as quickly as he could. Going on to slide 22, with continued research, however, the Chinese were already on their way to becoming a nuclear power, and only 4 years later, they managed to explode their first atomic device. And it was only 32 months later, I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, that they exploded a hydrogen bomb, a nuclear device that was far more powerful, as you can see on this slide. And it's a measure of the importance given to that program and to the missile program that these two programs were not messed with by Chairman Mao during this entire period, which included the chaotic phase of the Cultural Revolution that we will discuss next week. That atomic bomb, 1964, the hydrogen bomb, 1967, and in, I think it was 1970, China launched its first satellite, which meant that it could also, it was on the way, well on the way to launching, being able to launch an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile that could take a nuclear device from one continent to another. Happy news all around, all during the difficult phase of the Cultural Revolution. So we can see where the priorities were. Going on to slide 23, this doesn't make the Chinese all that different from anybody else, of course. But what makes it extraordinary and notable is that these developments occurred during such a difficult and chaotic period. Slide 23, meanwhile, in Taiwan, things were completely different. Land reform had nothing to do with socialization, that is, socialism. Land reform had everything to do with breaking up the ownership of land by large landlords and distributing it to the general population. It was quite a feat on the part of the Taiwan authorities. As I've already discussed, Taiwan was governed in an authoritarian manner. There was no brooking any real criticism in these first few years after they retreated to Taiwan in 1949. And things were difficult in the economy during those first few years, but by 1958, things were really getting straightened out, economically anyway. Light industry had started to develop. The level of education had risen quite dramatically. And 40% of the people by the end of the decade were living in cities, which was a far cry from like 15% or so at the beginning of the 1950s. So Taiwan was changing. There was a lot more capital. There was a lot of investment from the United States. The military was there in a big way. That is the American military. The Taiwan Defense Command was rather large. And Chiang Kai-shek was more confident in his position. As you can read in Taylor, which is a short reading, but is definitely worth the time. He was beginning to allow some criticism, partly to keep the Americans sweet, but also because he was more self-confident in his position. And when there was some scheming on the part of one of his senior generals, because there was pressure on Chiang Kai-shek to follow the Constitution and give up office, now that he was old and he'd been in office for so long, he just moved some people around and didn't shoot anybody, didn't assassinate anybody, took the middle road. Going on to slide 24, at the same time, things were changing in Taiwan's international position. It was no longer so secure as it had been in the early 1950s and middle 1950s. His relations with the U.S. administration were stable, but were entering a different phase. Previously, the Americans would give him almost anything he wanted. It wasn't completely that way, but he was refused very few things, and he was given a lot of military support. But the Americans withdrew that direct military support, except for arms sales and some intelligence assistance, by the late 1950s. And when the Kennedy administration came into power in 1961, they took a much more cautious stance toward Chiang Kai-shek and began to deny him all the toys he wanted, the aircraft, the weaponry, the naval vessels that he wanted, because they wanted to make sure that he didn't attack the mainland. Chiang Kai-shek, at this time, according to his diaries, had given up on retaking the mainland, but he considered it to be a question of appearances. I lifted a quote out of Taylor here to refer you to that reading. But while it was true that he was becoming more realistic in his old age, he still was clueless about a number of things. He didn't think that there was going to be any Sino-Soviet split, and indeed, after it happened, he didn't believe it. He thought it was just a, you'll pardon me, a communist plot. And he was also quite tone-deaf to his unpopularity in Tibet. He thought that the Tibetans could be brought to his side, and that he could run his own little revolution there. But that wasn't quite true. We'll stop here and wind up with the picture in Tibet on slide 26.